That's something that that's done in Europe and the U.S. And so, how can a policymaker in an emerging market deal with this excessive risk-taking by financial institutions? And I think there is a rationale for putting on capital controls. If you're worried that financial institutions in the rich world are taking on excessive risk, it may well be that the right policy prescription from an emerging markets standpoint is to insure yourself by keeping some of those capital flows out. And then there's and then I would mention another market distortion that's come up in some of the academic literature. Here I think of work of Mendoza, although maybe I'm going to be mischaracterizing this work a little bit, but what I would describe this as the problem that individual borrowers and lenders don't consider the macroeconomic externalities that occur when they take on a loan, or what happens if their project fails. So in particular, the issue is, suppose that an economy begins to have a downturn, and so a lender start reducing loans to individual firms. They say, well, maybe this project should slow down for a while. But the problem, so that may be a very rational economic decision on the part of the lender. It may be a rational economic decision on the part of the borrower, but the problem is that there are these macroeconomic externalities that if you then start cutting back on the projects, then these firms are doing less investment, they're hiring fewer workers. That's going to feed back onto the macroeconomy. That's going to, in turn, reduce the profitability of other investment projects. It might also, weaken the currency to the extent that loans are denominated in foreign currency. That might make it more difficult for firms to pay back loans. So lenders may contract lending further, and so there can be sort of a snowball effect. And the issue here is, again, it's a macroeconomic externality that isn't being taken into account by the private sector. They're only concerned with their own, is the loan profitable? Is it not? But if everybody's cutting back at the same time, then it's going to have a feedback effect. So again, because of that, there's a rationale for reducing loans ex ante to possibly putting on capital controls ex ante, precisely because borrowers and lenders don't take account of these macroeconomic externalities. So those are examples of distortions in the capital market. And again, the point here is that I want to think about what's wrong with the markets. Why do we care? Why are we so worried about surges of capital inflows? If markets are efficient, those shouldn't be a problem. Likewise, I want to think about the fact that we've heard surges of capital inflows can lead to real exchange rate appreciation. But what's wrong with the real exchange rate appreciation? Well, first of all, let me just make the point that, if markets were efficient, and here I'm not talking about capital markets and I'm not talking about foreign exchange markets, I'm saying that if goods markets were efficient, then the nominal exchange rate wouldn't matter at all. I mean, if it weren't for the fact that we had nominal wage stickiness and nominal price stickiness, and that we have nominal contracts, including loan contracts, contracts that are not indexed, then we really wouldn't care whether we had flexible nominal exchange rates or fixed nominal exchange rates. I mean, money would be a veil. So once we start talking about, should we have fixed exchange rates? Should we have purely floating exchange rates without any intervention by central banks? Should we have some sorts of controls over exchange rates, or at least some kind of intervention? I mean, and we have to understand that if we think that's a relevant question, we're already acknowledging that there's some kind of nominal stickiness that we're worried about, and that nominal stickiness in itself, I would argue, means that purely floating exchange rates, unfettered floating exchange rates, are not necessarily going to give you efficient outcomes. It's easy to think of cases where even though foreign exchange markets are acting efficiently. So first of all, let me step back. I mean, of course, there's also the possibility that there are bubbles and waves of optimism in foreign exchange markets, and then clearly foreign exchange rates are going to get misaligned, and particularly if nominal wages and prices don't adjust rapidly, you could get big real exchange rate misalignments just because of these inefficiencies in the foreign exchange market. But the thing I want to focus on is that even if the foreign exchange markets are efficient, that is, even if investors in the foreign exchange market are thinking rationally, that nonetheless foreign exchange rates are asset prices, and they're driven by things like risk, and they're driven by expectations of the future. And yet, those things that drive nominal exchange rates are going to have implications for real exchange rates that may be distortionary. So let me not point at Chile or Mexico. Let me give an example from the advanced country. In September 2008, when the world financial system was collapsing, that's kind of like November 2011. Suddenly the dollar got a lot stronger, but that was really, that was sort of a surprising thing. The dollar got much stronger, even though the financial panic was occurring in the U.S. So why did that happen? There are theories about why it happened. Maybe the U.S. was considered a safe haven, or maybe there was a liquidity shortage in the U.S. and a dollar shortage, and so that pushed up the price of dollars. And that seemed like a perfectly rational way for foreign exchange markets to respond to that crisis. But it had real consequences, and the real consequences were that it drove up, the appreciation of the dollar drove up the costs for American producers, and it drove down the costs for German producers. Suddenly, German producers were, the dynamos of the world market, but it wasn't because German producers had a sudden surge of efficiency, or it wasn't because American firms had suddenly lost their productive techniques. It had entirely, it was entirely driven by forces that were outside the goods market. It was this risk and this liquidity shortages, and yet it had these effects of leading to real exchange rate misalignments. Now there's this I think almost, I think inevitably it's unkillable view that somehow purely floating exchange rates are always going to deliver the right outcome. And the typical way now the argument is made is to point to special cases where they have delivered the right outcome. And so today, actually, maybe it's literally today because I haven't checked the news in the last couple hours, but there's talk about, well, if Greece only weren't on the euro, if only they had their own currency, then everything would be solved because the drachma would depreciate, and that would lead to an appropriate adjustment of real wages, and for sure that would happen. I mean, if Greece left the eurozone, there would be a real depreciation. And so, what do I say to that? I mean, the first point is that you can always you can always pick examples where it works, but even when you pick examples that work, like the case of the, if Greece only left the eurozone, they would get a real depreciation. I mean, I think it's very hard to make the case you would get the right real depreciation in that case. In fact, I would bet that that markets would overreact, that there would be a huge depreciation of the drachma, and there would be an excessive real depreciation, that the relative wages of Greek would fall too much. So my point here is that there's no real guarantee that foreign exchange markets deliver the right outcome. But the problem with using policy to target exchange rates, and I'm not saying fix them, but using policy to target exchange rates, is that if you're devoting monetary policy toward targeting the exchange rate, then you're giving up other important targets like inflation targeting or worrying about the output gap. So there may be conflicts between your desire to target inflation or target the output gap on the one hand and target exchange rates on the other hand. So actually, here's a reason why you may actually introduce capital controls, even though they're distortionary, because capital controls would then allow some effectiveness of sterilized interventions. So it's quite possible that a country could achieve better outcomes, even though they're imposing capital controls. They could achieve better outcomes by being allowed to more effectively use sterilized interventions. So here, the rationale for capital controls is not a distortion in capital markets. It's not really even a distortion in foreign exchange markets. I'm talking about distortions in goods markets, wage and price stickiness, but because of that, there may be a reason to introduce capital controls as a way to have better control over the exchange rate. Okay, so those, so as I said, when I began, I mean, it's easy actually to come up with reasons why you may want to limit capital flows and introduce policies that to control capital inflows. So I think I should conclude by reminding us why we don't want to do that. I mean, we think that that capital flows actually, even if they were completely unfettered, might deliver better outcomes because the reason that the typical explanation is capital, should move toward its most productive use, and markets can determine best what the most productive use of that capital is. Moreover, a country that allows capital inflow may be imposing more market discipline on the local economy, so that they may drive out inefficient firms in favor of better organized and managed companies, because the flow of funds from abroad may favor the better organized and managed companies. And it may also be that the flow of funds from abroad would spur development of local capital markets as well. So these are all reasons why we may want to allow unfettered capital inflows, even if in the face of the distortions I mentioned. And same with exchange rates. I mean, it's even though I am gravely doubt that purely floating exchange rates with no intervention deliver an optimal outcome, I'm not at all convinced that policymakers could do better, that they would choose a better level for the exchange rate. So, from my perspective, I think the real issue with China, that people have with China, is not that they're controlling the exchange rate, it's the level that they've chosen. If they had chosen a much stronger or much different exchange rate than what they've chosen, there wouldn't be quite as much hoo-ha about that. All right, so that's my conclusions on the theoretical literature. I want to mention a few things from the empirical literatures. I've already said there's a lot of literature that casts doubt on whether capital controls have any effect on limiting the size of flows. Most of the literature has focused on net flows, but there's a really interesting paper by Forbes and Warnock that was part of a project that the NBER sponsored, and I'm just standing up here advertising it. I was a co-organizer of the conference, and you should check out the website, the NBER's website. It was a great project that brought out a lot of new data on the international capital flows during and after the crisis. One of the papers in there was by Forbes and Warnock, and the interesting contribution was that they were not just looking at net flows, but they were looking at gross flows, gross inflows and outflows around the world, and they could tell who was the owner of those flows. Were the flows by foreigners or by local residents? And but what they found was that, in fact, on average, the introduction of capital controls did not have much effect during extreme episodes, like episodes of capital surges where foreigners bring in a lot of money, or episodes of stops when they take out money. And that's consistent with what previous literature has found, that the total size of capital flows is not very well controlled by policy, although this is exactly the empirical finding that I say is subject to this caveat that we can't control for why the country put on the controls to begin with. However, there is a lot of, there is some evidence that controls can be effective in tilting the composition of flows. So that's De Gregorio and his co-authors found that the Chilean controls were able to twist the composition of inflows toward longer maturities. That same finding has been confirmed in a recent paper by Austri and his colleagues at the IMF. So they have two papers, but I particularly want you to go and look at the one that was done for the NBER project. That one brought out a lot of interesting new evidence, but in particular they found that controls seem to be effective not only in tilting the composition of flows from short run to long run, but also that controls that are aimed at limiting the currency composition of flows can be effective. So one of the concerns could be that there would be excessive lending to a emerging market in foreign currency, and those kind of controls can be effective. All right, let me just mention a couple of other facts here, empirical facts. So that same study by Austri and all found that countries with capital controls rebounded more quickly from the financial crisis than countries that did not have capital controls. So if you compare the performance in the pre-crisis period to the post-crisis period, 2004-2007 versus 2008-2009, countries with capital controls did better. Now that's something that I think needs more study to find out precisely why these countries did better, but it's certainly an intriguing finding. On the other hand, a well-known study by Chin and Ito found that capital inflows are effective in developing local financial markets, particularly equity markets, although that's especially true only when bureaucratic quality is high and measures of law and order are high. And finally, on the empirical evidence, I would say there's mixed evidence actually on whether imposing controls on capital inflows actually does allow a country to better control exchange rates and have more independent monetary policy. Although this survey I mentioned by Magud, Reinhardt, and Rogoff does conclude that on the whole, the evidence weakly favors the conclusion that you are able to gain more control of your exchange rate if you introduce capital controls. But again, I think there's issues in the empirical work of measuring what the effect of capital controls are. And in particular, I think that the empirical literature really has not gotten very far along at all in answering the overall question of are controls beneficial for the economy as a whole. I mean, that's a whole nother step from beyond asking, do they achieve their objective? Do they limit the amount of flows, or do they change the composition? But the real question is, are economies better off with controls? And I think we haven't gotten very far with that. Let me conclude with one final thought. And this is a little bit off the subject of most of what I've been saying about controls, and maybe is more pertinent for the next BIS panel on prudential policies. But it is striking to me that one real issue that emerging markets face is that they are not able themselves to very well implement prudential policies. And the reason is that, of course, first of all, an emerging market doesn't have much control over what Citibank in New York is going to do, or a big French or Swiss bank. I mean, that's something that those policies have to be set in the U.S. and Europe. But beyond which, it's very hard, I think, for an emerging market to even try to introduce prudential policies within its own borders for financial institutions, because the big financial institutions around the world can react to that by saying, fine, you want to impose these regulations on us, you want to